Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here today on Mint Press. As you know, we are battling algorithmic marginalization on a daily basis here on YouTube and other platforms. So we hope that those who are watching this can share, like, and comment on this video in order to improve our viewership and spread this important information about the way that our society is controlled by the ruling elites. Now, today is, of course, September the 11th, 2023. This marks the day of the other 9/11. Everybody will be thinking about the 9/11 which took place in the United States. But in 1973, there was another important event that had massive consequences, not only in Chile, but also in other places. It was very much a blueprint for other operations which were extended onto other societies. And today we are here to talk to two special guests about the other 9/11 and also to talk about an important film project that they are embarking on about this subject. So we are joined today to discuss the coup against the democratically elected government led by Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, which was, of course, supported by the CIA and Britain and led to decades-long dictatorial rule of General Augusto Pinochet, which saw cruelty on an industrial scale and saw the application of neoliberal economics to the Chilean society, which led to massive suffering also. So we are joined by investigative journalist from Declassified UK, John McEvoy. Thank you for joining us, John.
Thanks very much for having me.
And we're also joined by Roberto Navarette, who was at the time of the coup, a 17-year-old medical student. He was imprisoned in the infamous Chile Stadium. He was subjected to torture and also survived being shot in the arm during this coup. And we are grateful to both of you for joining us today to talk to us about this important subject, which unfortunately is somewhat positioned outside the earshot and the eyesight of the masses, shall we say. And for me, there was a particular speech of Salvador Allende's that connected with me when reading the book of Victor Figueroa Clark, his book about Allende. And Allende described himself as an interpreter of yearnings for justice. And, you know, before he was elected to government in Chile, he gave this... He looked upon the society as somebody who had spent his time washing corpses. He said he discovered the ills of the society in the wounds of the dead. And that was always something that I found massively powerful. But just before we get into the first question, I just wanted to read this passage that Allende said in 1970. So those who have exploited Chile for copper in the last 42 years have made more than $4,000 million in profit, although their initial investment was no more than $30 million. In my country, there are 600,000 children who will never be able to enjoy life in a normal human way because during the first 8 months of their life, they did not receive the minimum amount of protein. So to start with Roberto, I wanted to ask you, who was Salvador Allende?
Salvador Allende was a politician of the Socialist Party. He was a founder of the Socialist Party in Chile, in a country where the whole political struggle took place within the confines of parliamentary democracy. So Chile, although it did have some activities of the military in the early part of the 20th century, basically through the middle, especially during the interwar periods, it was basically run by politicians of the right mainly. And Salvador Allende was convinced that he could develop a movement to transform society within the realms of parliamentary democracy or presidential democracy as it is in Chile, because it's not a parliamentary system. So he attempted to, he went for election several times, 3 times, and was elected in 1970 for the 3rd time. However, he wasn't, and you mentioned a book by Victor Figueroa Clark on Allende, and he wasn't the conventional left politician, because he combined the yearnings of revolutionary change with the it's just that the methods for change in Chile, he thought, could be peaceful. Latin America, of course, was marked by the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and Fidel Castro was a large figure in change, and because he was confronting the United States 80 miles from its borders. So that was Salvador Allende.
Mm. And was there a difference in the way that the well-known 40 committee headed by Henry Kissinger, instrument of US policy, propaganda arm, in the first 2 attempts by Salvador Allende, what would you say marked the 3rd attempt and explain the success? 40% of the population suffered from malnutrition. You had a situation where the richest 2% of the population of Chile had nearly 50% of the country's earnings, while the poorest 28% had less than 5%. Now, we're talking about real, a kind of a deeply set inequality in the society, which would explain why there was this receptivity to Salvador Allende and the ideas of the political movement that he represented. What do you think was the reason for the success? What was the reason for the victory the 3rd time around?
There's been a whole process of accumulation of political force in the Popular Front throughout the middle part of the 20th century. Chile had a Popular Front government in 1939, of which Salvador Allende was the Minister of Health. So already he was a member of one of the progressive governments that wanted to create and to industrialize Chile, because Chile is a mining country. First, it was saltpeter, and one of the civil wars that happened in Chile was because of the resources of saltpeter were concentrated in British hands, and the one of the presidents of Chile at the time had to commit suicide because of the barons of saltpeter. Now, Salvador Allende...
Which year was that, sorry, Roberto?
1891, and it was President Balmaceda. He committed suicide. He was a coup was set against him. He wanted to, under the influence of the barons that controlled saltpeter. Then copper. You mentioned copper. Copper is very important. Chile is the first world producer of copper. It was already at the time of Allende. It still is, and the vast proportion, and it's been run by foreign companies. Allende's achievement during his government was to nationalize copper, and that put Allende. But even before, he included that in the program, and the Americans knew, and therefore they start plotting and preventing Allende from winning government from a lot earlier than that. So they have a fuel belt program in the 60s. They had a number of programs. The Committee of the 40s was just one example of an ongoing work by the United States to undermine Chilean political process and to undermine the left. They knew that Allende was a special type of leftist because, as I said earlier on, Allende wasn't just a parliamentary politician that thought you could change things through reform rather than revolution. He was an admirer of Che Guevara, and they realized that it wasn't one or the other, that you really had to use and consider the conditions of the country. He thought Chile was ready to undergo change through the political process.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, also the interesting thing is you see reports of how angry the United States were getting at even the concept of raising the price of copper by 2 cents. So you can imagine what the idea of nationalizing this important industry, you look at the Vietnam War effort and how reliant that was on what was coming out of Chile. You look at Pepsi, for example. Chile was massively important to the company Pepsi, and Pepsi had serious sway with the US government, specifically under Nixon. They say in the Pepsi versus Coke battle, almost all the other presidents were leaning more in the direction of Coca-Cola, but Richard Nixon actually leaned more in the direction of Pepsi. And I guess, John, this is where, we bring you into the conversation a bit too, because as Roberto was talking about, when Chile won its battle for independence against the Spanish in 1818, London quickly filled in that void and picked up this kind of economic relationship with Chile, which saw 50% of the exports from Chile going to England. What was Britain's role in this kind of these mechanisms during the 60s? What was Britain up to alongside the US?
Yeah, so I mean, you've gone back as far as the 1800s there, which is another important kind of period of British foreign policy in Latin America. There's a great quote by the former, I think, Foreign Secretary George Canning, which is, "Spanish America is free, and if we do not mishandle our affairs, it is ours, or it is British." And throughout the next century, British kind of held an informal empire over Latin America, which basically meant, not direct political control, but economic control to such an extent, as you say, that many of the key industries were held or owned by British companies or British merchant houses. And I mean, this continued up definitely until the end of the First World War. But by the end of the Second World War, Britain's kind of informal empire in Latin America had massively subsided, and the US had mostly moved in, US corporations and so on and so forth. Which brings us to the 1960s, which is why I think it's so interesting and important. The evidence of British involvement and kind of covert interference in Latin America, and particularly in Chile during the 1960s. So, I mean, as I was saying, Britain had no longer had a significant direct commercial interest in Chile. But the Cuban Revolution, as Roberto was saying, it also terrified key planners in the British Foreign Office. And I mean, you can read Cable or you can read the discussions of the Joint Intelligence Chiefs at the time, where they're basically terrified that the example of Cuba is going to spread across the continent. So as they see Allende growing in popularity during the 1960s, I mean, let's remember in 1958, he only lost the election by about 33,000 votes, about 3% of the vote. So he came really close. Then a year later, you have the Cuban Revolution. And by the 1964 election, Allende's looking likely to potentially win again. I mean, he's one of the leading candidates, at least, against the main competitor, the Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei. And it's in this period where you get this kind of influx of British covert interference in Latin America. So one arm of this was MI6. And this is something that I'm going to be writing about in Declassified UK soon. But the Foreign Office basically sent an MI6 officer named Eric Lambert to Latin America. He toured a number of different countries, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. He also visited Chile. And what his basic role was to transpose all of the methods of counterinsurgency policing that he'd garnered throughout his experience in countries like Malaya, and basically teach Latin American security forces how to contain domestic resistance. So you've got this MI6 role that happens at the time. And a key part of this was actually teaching Latin American militaries and police in interrogation tactics. And we kind of know that that's an allusion to torture. But simultaneously, you've got the Information Research Department massively expands its operations in Latin America. And the Information Research Department, the IRD, was the Foreign Office's covert propaganda arm. And basically what it did was it collected information on communist organization activities, and it distributed it to influential figures worldwide. And the idea was basically to make militaries, politicians, journalists better informed about communism, but also to cultivate agents of influence in foreign countries. But in 1962, the IRD sends a series of IRD field officers, which are specialists in covert propaganda operations, and it sends them across the region, particularly in this period in Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. But it also increases its operations in Chile. And these operations between 1962 and 1964, and this is explicit in the documents, to prevent Allende from ever being elected. And what they're doing is they're distributing material to key military figures, and so on and so forth. This campaign intensifies massively during the late 1960s. A field officer is eventually sent to Chile, somebody called Pat Dyer. And what his job basically to do is to try and split the left in Chile. One of his key operations is to kind of plant stories in the press, use different forms of information to basically, and to quote, to split the hotheads and the armchair revolutionaries. And he considered Allende an armchair revolutionary. So to basically split those who thought that violence as a means to come to power and those that believed in the kind of Popular Front democratic process. So obviously you've got the US covert action. I mean, we know about that. We know about the CIA. We know that the US funded over 50% of Frey's 1964 campaign. But we've also got this period of British intervention as well. And it's with a similar goal. It's to prevent Allende from ever being elected. And these documents, unlike the CIA documents that came out in the 1970s, they've only came out since 2019. So the nature of British intervention in Chile is much more secret, in fact, than the CIA.
Fantastic. And, that's why your work is so important. And we encourage any viewers to support John's work, to support Declassified UK, and also support the new film that you're making with Alborada. And you mentioned the Christian Democrats. We have a Senate report that revealed that between 1962 and 1964, this group received $3 million from the US government. And actually in the 60s, $3 million, what that is worth today, this is a huge amount of money. We also know about terror attacks which were blamed on leftist groups, but it was not clear who actually carried them out, happening around elections. In a way, this noose is kind of created with the propaganda side of things that is often outsourced to the British, or the British are directly doing it. But then you've also got the other side, which is, where the generals are trained, where the US is able to build these relationships with different governments in Latin America, the School of Latin Americas, where they train them. And then you've got the Chicago School, which provides the sort of economic basis to what you want to impose upon that society. And I guess that's where we kind of bring in this character, Augusto Pinochet. Roberto, can you tell us about him? Who was he?
He was a relatively obscure general. He was, you can see him in the photographs, he was always wearing dark glasses to, basically hide his emotions and he appeared to be a very loyal member of the army. He was supported I should say that the there was a tradition of constitutionalism in the army to such an extent that the United States saw the removal of the head of the army at the time when Allende was elected as a problem for a coup to succeed before Allende took power. After the election, the United States tried within a very short period of time, since September 70 to October, to stage a coup. And they said they intended to kidnap the head of the army, General René Schneider. In fact, that was a botched operation, and they killed him. And it was using weapons provided by the United States under diplomatic cover. So the weapons were in turn using diplomatic privilege and sent out of the country in the same way, with two generals of the army directly involved in the assassination. General Viau, who had previously involved in staging a coup during the Frey government, and the general head of the army in Santiago, General Canales. They were directly involved, and they were assets of the CIA. And so the CIA was involved in the overthrow of Allende even before Allende took place. And this is really important because the right has always used the excuse that it was the collapse of the economy under Allende that provided the conditions for the coup. No, they tried the coup even before Allende even take power. So this was as John says, this was a long-standing operation by the American intelligence services, but we are now learning that the British intelligence services were involved throughout at least a decade, if not more, prior to the election of Allende. So Pinochet, you asked me about Pinochet. All I want to say is that he was an unknown figure, basically, before. He only joined the nucleus of the plotters of the coup just a couple of weeks before. He didn't sort of participate in the planning of the coup.
His utility was perhaps measured by his lack of a real a backbone, a real background in a way. You know, you sometimes see people that are elevated through their mediocrity,
Exactly.
And that may apply, I imagine.
Franco was his model.
There you go.
It was similar.
Yeah. And so that then leads us to 1973. You are a 17-year-old boy.
Yeah.
What happened on that day when the presidential palace was being bombed?
Well, I was I got up very early that day, and I was going to the medical school as usual with my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and we went fairly early and realized that there was something going on, and we got to the medical faculty, and there was a meeting of the students, and we decided that after we start seeing that the military were surrounding the Moneda Palace, that there was going to be a coup and there was going to be a lot of people killed. And so, being medical students, we thought that we would join our elder colleagues who were more really prepared to help in the case of people who would be wounded. So we moved to a place, a neighborhood nearby in the north of Santiago, and saw the planes going on to central Santiago to bomb the Moneda Palace. There was a blockade of information that day, but nobody knew where the president, what has happened to the president. But then gradually it filtered out that they said that he had committed suicide. But it's known that he was fighting in the Moneda Palace, and the circumstances of his death are unclear until now.
Yeah. But from your perspective, what happened?
From my perspective, we went to this place and we decided to stay there in case that some resistance could be organized. But since there were no, the left was totally demobilized, there was no weapons, there were no ways in which you could fight an army, a professional army. So the people who were most involved in the student organization wanted to stay there for a bit longer, and we sent our colleagues back home just in case because obviously there was, and then we were actually having a meeting, and the military came and sort of detained us and shot us. And, I was shot in the arm, but obviously we had no weapons to defend ourselves. So they basically detained us and took us to the National Stadium, where lots of people were being concentrated. One of the perhaps most well-known cases was the singer Victor Jara, who had been detained in what used to be called the Chile Stadium, which is not the same as the National Stadium. I was in the National Stadium, and the Chile Stadium was a smaller stadium where he was held, and he actually was killed in that place, and the rest of the people moved on to the National Stadium. So we actually then later met all the people who had been with Victor Jara, and so his body was thrown somewhere, and eventually he was found by his family. But that was the situation.
And if you could also tell us, Roberto, about how you then came to live in London.
Well, I was in prison for about a year, and after that period, I wanted to stay in Chile because I thought that the people had to organize a resistance against the government, and that people were very frightened. The fact that I had been in prison already meant that I had developed quite a lot of connections with other people who were members of the left. We were with much older people in prison, and so that acted as a school also to prepare. However, after a while, we were again a razzia. The police and the secret police developed very, very brutal methods, and they would basically torture people until they gave names. So people gave names, and my wife was detained, and then I had to go and hide for a while, and she was made to disappear for a while, and so at that point I had to take asylum in a foreign embassy where I was for about 6 months, and she was detained for a year. So after about 2 years, I came to Britain as a refugee directly from the embassy of Venezuela, where I had taken asylum.
Mm. And also, what can you tell us about the Chicago School and the role that it had in forming what was to be the next phase of Chile's history?
Well, it became quite clear later, and slowly, I think we have become became more clear after the whole process, economic process, developed fully, which was not immediately after the coup, but over several years afterwards, that there was a plan that was quite unusual in Chile, because remember I said not only the Chilean left, but also the Christian Democrats, who were some of them were center left, some of them center right, had economic model of import substitution industrialization. So the country needed to develop its industry, etc., etc. However, this new model that was applied in Chile was completely new, and it was influenced by Milton Friedman in Chicago, and basically assigned roles to these economies in different countries according to what they call the um, comparative advantages. So Chile's copper that was important, so Chile should concentrate in exporting copper, but not to industrialize copper. So the production of copper, we were not going to make wires or anything with that copper, but just simply ship the and not only copper was there was gold, molybdenum, a lot of other minerals, but they assessed the price of the copper was assessed basically on the copper content exclusively, but they obviously got extra benefits from the other minerals that were there. And then the other thing is the privatization and financialization. And this became more and more clear as the military government started. It's important to say that this was such an extreme model for the context of Chile that it wouldn't have been able to do it without the military boot, without the guns. So it was actually forced upon the population. The pension system was completely overhauled, and today we're seeing the consequences of people having very, very low pensions because they finance the Chilean capitalists, financed using the pension funds that were people were obliged to provide those funds for the friends of Pinochet and the people of the elite, economic elites of Chile.
And you've mentioned actually the asset stripping of the state, the way in which oligarchs were able to, similar in the way after the deconstruction of the Soviet Union,
Absolutely.
that you had this oligarch elite form that was just stripping the functions of the state and divvying it up to private hands. Could you tell us a little bit more about that in the context of Chile?
I think that happened, for example, in every single bit. Chile had, for example, a railway system, which became totally dismantled. There was only a little bit of a railway left, but the whole of the Chile is 4,000 kilometers long, and we had a railway covering that from the government of Balmaceda, beginning of the government of Balmaceda in 1890 to the whole of the 20th century. So there was a lot of money invested in infrastructure of the country. The national airline was sold. Allende had nationalized several banks. They were reprivatized. The agrarian reform, that was a very important change that Allende did. And those plots that had been given to the peasants were reprivatized because people were left without any kind of fertilizers or things or even knowledge on how to do the planning. So they actually were reprivatized, and a new capitalized agro industry was created on that basis.
And how would you say that the trajectory that was established during that period has affected today's situation in Chile, where you have seen young people taking to the streets, mobilizing politically? How has that trajectory set in place by the Pinochet era led to what you have today?
Well, it was started by the Pinochet, but I should say the people who replaced Pinochet and the democratic consensus that was created was a false consensus where the United States and the various actors played important roles. They prevented a return to the economic programs that Allende had developed, and they went through a different route. It was basically continuing the economic model that had been set by Pinochet, and over the next 20 years, In some areas, it was even deepened. And the oligarchs that participated in the benefits from the system, again, were dressed with new democratic clothing.
Yeah.
But it was a willing change that some people of some left were continuing, a sort of neo-Blairite kind of type of left.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because, 73 is the same year that you have the war of attrition between Syria, Libya, Egypt on one side and Israel on the other side, which then led to the oil embargo, whereby the Gulf states refused to sell their oil to states that are supporting Israel in what they are doing. And then that leads to significant economic distress in Britain, which then leads to Callaghan going to the IMF in this country. And that then leads to the new neoliberal consensus within the British political elite. John, what can you tell us about the idea of Chile as actually a laboratory for this economic shock therapy?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Milton Friedman earlier. I think Milton Friedman said something like, what Pinochet achieved through the barrel of the gun, Margaret Thatcher achieved through the electoral system, or something along those lines, paraphrasing. But yeah, I mean, when Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, I mean, she had obviously seen what was happening in Chile, but she was also influenced by the same kind of figures, the same kind of neoliberal thinkers like Friedman and so on. And so, a similar model was obviously implemented in Britain with the deregulation of loads of different industries, with mass privatisation, and so on and so forth. And, for that reason, Margaret Thatcher and Augusto Pinochet developed a relationship in this period. I mean, she went on to call Pinochet a staunch, true friend of Britain. She also said, laughably, that Pinochet returned democracy to Chile. So during the Pinochet, during the late 70s and 80s, the two actually never met personally. But the influence that each one had on the other, I think, is actually outside, is actually greater than what we give it credit for at the moment. And I think the main issue is the Falklands War. So before the Falklands War, Thatcher was at that point the least popular prime minister since records had begun. There was absolutely no way that she was going to win another election. Then the Falklands War happens, and Pinochet and the Chilean regime offers really substantial and crucial assistance to the British war effort in terms of letting them use air bases, in terms of the provision of intelligence, about which we still actually don't have that much information. I've looked in the National Archives at the documents on Operation Corporate, and some of them are this large, and there's maybe 3 actual documents in them. Everything else has been removed. So there's a massive amount of information that we still don't know. But what we do know is that Chile and Pinochet provided an incredible amount of assistance to the British war effort, and by extension, probably saved Margaret Thatcher's premiership. And as we know, that relationship extended well beyond both of their terms as leader of the country. When Pinochet was under house arrest in London following his back surgery and following the international arrest warrant for him, Margaret Thatcher not only lobbied the British government on his behalf by sending letters to Jack Straw, the Home Secretary at the time, she also visited him in his home. She went for tea with him on numerous different occasions. So she was kind of a lonely voice in Britain at that time who still vehemently supported Pinochet. It's a long-standing relationship between the two, and I think the Falklands War is a central component to it. And of course, after the Falklands War, the Chilean military was given a number of different arms deals on very, very lenient terms. Perhaps some planes were actually given to the Chilean Air Force for free. So that relationship is a very, very fundamentally on a military and economic basis, and extended over a period of decades.
Interestingly, with the Falklands War, you had this lesson learnt by military establishments from the defeat in Vietnam. their idea had been. It was the iconic pictures that came out of Vietnam, which really galvanized the populations against, led to people burning themselves outside the White House in protest against Vietnam. So the lesson the British elite learned and then applied to Falklands was that they would only allow literally one or two specially vetted, embedded journalists with the British military to go there and cover the war. And really, that speaks to how important the work that Declassified UK, Mint Press, and others at Barada is doing in order to shine a light on, the other, what is the other side of the elite narrative. So then I guess, John, the question would be, to take it back just a little bit to 73 and September the 11th, what was Britain's role in all of that, and what have you been able to discern from your research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the UK government has released files on it over the decades since the coup, 1973, and the likes of the editor of Declassified, Mark Curtis, and the historian Grace Livingston have worked on some of these documents, done some really important work. And so what we knew from the earlier releases was that the Edward Heath government, the Conservative government under Edward Heath, welcomed the coup. The Foreign Office at the time, and a quote saw that the opportunities for investment were infinitely better under Pinochet than under Allende. Britain was one of the first countries to open up diplomatic relations with the Pinochet regime, and also started arms sales as well. But what we didn't really know was the extent of actual direct military or intelligence assistance to the Chilean regime in the immediate aftermath of the coup. And so what I found in the archives, and these are documents that were released, I think in February 2022, very, very recently, was that the IRD, the secret propaganda unit that I mentioned earlier, basically agreed to start releasing material to Chile's military intelligence. Now, this is the same, obviously, Chilean military intelligence that's engaging in widespread torture, that the British Foreign Office at the time is saying, and I quote, I don't think anybody denies that torture is going on in Chile. They're very much aware that these security state institutions are engaging in massive human rights abuses, but they start disseminating material to them, including to the information officers of the state, but crucially the military intelligence. And what the documents also show is that at this time they started to disseminate to the Chilean security forces, and probably by extension the military intelligence, manuals on Britain's counterinsurgency operations, particularly during the 50s in Southeast, well, the 40s and 50s in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaya, which was seen as the kind of the ideal counterinsurgency conflict that was seen as that Britain had won. It had managed to suppress them.
In which the British were beheading people, putting it on postcards, and then it being sold in Britain. Yeah, exactly.
So it's actually the malign campaign where the term "winning hearts and minds" comes from. And the British rhetoric about their counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya was that the primacy of police over military control, not using coercive force where possible. So this was the rhetoric, and this is the general rhetoric about British counterinsurgency theory. But in reality, as you say, it involved heinous crimes like head chopping. They sequestered 500,000 civilians in resettlement camps. There was aerial bombardment, killing fields. So the civilian population was absolutely not spared the repression that was supposedly simply designed for the guerrillas. So this is the British military experience that is being brought to Latin America in this period as the gold standard of counterinsurgency. So they're advising the Pinochet regime that they know is engaging in torture on how to basically
do it better,
do it in a more sophisticated way, and do it in a bit less obvious is basically what they're saying. Maybe be a bit less obvious about it, and make sure there's some kind of constitutional structure to justify it, so it doesn't seem arbitrary. Even though British counterinsurgency was arbitrary because it was backed up by special legalistic measures that basically put countries into a state of emergency where the militaries weren't actually constrained by these laws on limiting coercive control. So effectively what they were saying was to the Chilean military, can you be a little bit less explicit about these horrendous human rights violations, because it's making it difficult for us to give you the diplomatic support that we'd like to anyway, because we like what you're doing economically.
Amazing. Wow. So, John, can you tell us a bit? Well, I guess actually, firstly, Roberto, could you tell us about Alborada, why it was founded, and what it does?
Well, I should say it's not really, I'm not the organizer of Alborada. My son Pablo Navarrete is, and I participated and I have helped in some ways in some of the films that they have done in Latin America. And we started in 1988, or no, sorry, 2007 or 2008, after Pablo spent a period in Venezuela, and he wanted to do a film on the political process that was going on in Venezuela. So in 2007, Alborada was created, and he did a film called The Revolution, Inside the Revolution, where was basically asking ordinary people from the barrios why would they support the Chavez government at the time. It was involved. The film did not interview any of the government officials, but was basically going on to the support groups at the grassroots level to find out what was bringing them to support a process of change that was going on in Venezuela. And there were many parallels to Chile, because as you said at the beginning of your introduction to this program, the factor that created the people wanting political change was the inequality in society, and the profound inequality, economic inequality in the society. So this was evident in Venezuela too. And so we went to see the poorest people in the barrios, interview them and ask them what were the things that they wanted change in the society. And that was how he started, and he then did several films in Colombia and in other parts of Latin America. And of course, his parents were from Chile. He has now turned his eye into Chile a bit more. I did a film around the student movement in 2010, 2011. And the whole focus now has been to document the process of change that has happened after the return of democracy to Chile, and how the whole process is now, in some ways, more complex than we anticipated initially.
Mm. So, John, can you tell us about the film The Other 9/11, which we are fundraising for at the moment? So please do donate to that. But yeah, tell us about The Other 9/11.
Yeah, so me and Pablo, Roberto's son, we're working on a forthcoming documentary in early 2024 called Britain and the Other 9/11. And it's about many of the things that I've spoken about today. It's basically a history of British interference in Chile between 1960 and 2000. We're centering on the coup in 1973 because it's the central kind of event that draws everything together. But we're taking it from the 1960s using all of these declassified files that have only came out in the last few years to basically show how Britain first tried to prevent Allende from ever being elected, how during the early 1970s, through the Allende period, we're looking into what MI6 was up to in Chile, because we know now that the Australian Secret Intelligence Service was acting as a proxy to the CIA. So we're looking closely at what MI6 was up to, and we're going to have some revelations on that front, because we know that the MI6 had a station in the British Embassy in Santiago, and an MI6 officer named David Spedding was attached to the British Embassy in Santiago between 1972 and 1974. Obviously, the key dates when the coup occurred. He went on to be the MI6 chief. Following that, we're looking at the secret military and intelligence support that Britain provided to the Pinochet regime. We're going to be looking at the Falklands War as well, and the relationship, obviously, that emerged between Thatcher and Pinochet in this period. And the culmination point is the Pinochet's extradition process between 1998 and 2000. Now, we've been told by the Labour government, by the media, that Pinochet's extradition to Spain for crimes against humanity was refused on health grounds. What we've found is that there are various claims to dispute this, to show that there was actually secret backdoor negotiations going on at the time. And interestingly, one of them actually dates back to the Falklands War. The British government promised Pinochet healthcare in Britain in return for his services during the Falklands War. And so this was one of the complicating factors that featured in British thinking. And when we were in Chile, we actually spoke to a former Chilean official with knowledge of the case, who told us that the key issue was that the British government did not want the principle of universal jurisdiction to ever become a thing, because obviously 3 years after Pinochet was allowed to return to Chile, Britain launches an illegal invasion of Iraq, and therefore obviously Tony Blair might have been subject to the same principle of universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity and war crimes as he allowed Pinochet to get off with. So basically allowing Pinochet to be free allowed the imperialist powers and the global powers like the US and Britain to get away with future war crimes. It was basically a carte blanche. So I think that's a really important part of the story, and we're going to try and tell it as well.
Fantastic. And John, also, can you tell the audience and me why it's important that they support this film and donate to the new fundraiser?
Yeah, well, I saw an article in The Economist the other day basically saying, forget about Pinochet, forget about Allende, they're better off left as, historical characters that we don't think about anymore. I think
the Economist would say that, wouldn't he?
Well, of course, I mean, we're going to go into The Economist as well in the film, and The Economist's role in the coup. But I think it's obviously of vital importance to remember, the legacy of Allende, to remember the legacy of what he represented, and also the defiance of global powers like the US and Britain, and also to know exactly what the British government is doing in our name. And also for people in Chile to know what kind the true extent of foreign meddling in their country. So I think these are core features of actually being sovereign.
And any functioning media would carry out investigation into what Britain was doing at that time. But you don't have that from any along the spectrum of what we accept as a mainstream media. And so it falls upon the viewers, it falls upon people like yourself to really get stuck in to researching that information, which essentially is public interest information. So for that reason, we again call on you to support this fundraiser. Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you, John, for your important work. I just want to close off the show, actually, and that really flew by. I feel like we covered so much in what felt like a really short space of time. But before we close off the show, I want to cover a little bit about this Elon Musk and ADL beef, which is kicking off. The ADL is the Anti-Defamation League. It's a well-known Israel lobby group in the United States. And the billionaire owner / military contractor, Elon Musk, is now suing this organization, the Anti-Defamation League. He has asserted that the ADL has been lobbying companies from the beginning of Musk's takeover of Twitter. It's been lobbying companies to drop their advertising deals with Twitter. He claims that it's led to a 60% drop in Twitter, now known as X's, advertising revenue. Now, we're going to get into a little bit about what the ADL's relationship, not only with Israel, but the FBI is, but we're also going to get into the other side of the story, which is what Elon Musk's relationship with Israel is. I think it is absolutely vital that those who have suffered at the hands of this demonization, and it's mainly been leftists, people look at the ADL as some sort of it's similar to Starmer in a way, because they attribute to it this blank slatism. They say, oh, well, they don't really have politics. No, Starmer has politics. And in the case of the ADL, they have politics. When you look at the documents, they directly target leftists and pro-Palestinian figures more than they target the far right, for sure. But what you saw, a really interesting turn of events, which we may play on the show in this segment, is when a space, they call them Twitter space, was being held to discuss this current campaign to quote unquote ban the ADL. You had somebody who became involved in the conversation by the name of Vivian Berkovici. Now, she is the former Canadian ambassador to Israel. And she gets involved with this space and starts supporting the ADL side of the argument. Of course, ADL has alleged that Elon Musk is, an anti-Semite, as has been the routine that has been played out many times against many. And so she's backing up the ADL side of the story. And then at one point, somebody else in the space says to her, excuse me, Vivian, are you not a former employee of Black Cube, which is one of the intelligence agencies that, following a government decision in 2012, were founded in Israel, essentially to siphon off Israeli intelligence figures into private companies? Now, at which point this former ambassador of Canada to Israel exits the chat and completely disables her account.
I've been accused of all kinds of horrible things personally because I'm Jewish. And a number of listeners here, and maybe they'll have the courage and integrity to speak up, have already messaged me on Twitter saying, oh, well, we know which side you're on, don't we? A dual citizen, ergo dual Canadian-Israeli citizen, therefore she can't be trusted, can she?
I get this.
People who wrote those messages, any of the people who wrote those messages have the integrity to speak up now and tell me.
Well, Vivian, I have a question. If we're talking about conflicts of interest, is it true you work for an Israeli intelligence firm called Black Cube?
No, who are you? No.
Keith Woods. Nice to meet you.
I get accused of being Mossad every time I pop into his face.
I think we're going back to the moving away.
No, it's on our Wikipedia.
Yeah,
it's on our Wikipedia. I'm not
sure. You can state it. People could check out on the Wikipedia. I just want to go back to the specific points. And there's one point you made earlier, Vivian.
She didn't really answer.
Yeah, but she jumped off. That's like I wanted to keep it on the particular points.
I wonder why.
Now think about this. This was somebody who was an ambassador of Canada to another country, who then becomes an employee of a private intelligence company within that country, which has acted for Israeli interests around the world. It's a real interesting part of the whole neoliberal story, is the way in which, whether it's data management or intelligence, those things have been siphoned off into private companies, which make it far more difficult. When you're talking about what are state institutions, the ability to disguise agency was limited to some extent because it wasn't that far from leading back to the Foreign Office. Whereas now what you have is a whole plethora. I mean, there's thousands of organizations across the world with all types of obscure names, which are in essence spy agencies. And Black Cube is obviously one of them. And frankly, the ADL is one of them. We have to remember that before the ADL targeted somebody like Musk, it had been targeting political activists in the United States. It's believed to have collected confidential information on 10,000 political activists across 700 political organizations in 7 cities in the United States, from figures like Desmond Tutu to Martin Luther King. This is a spy agency. It even spied on organizations like Greenpeace and the United Farm Workers. We know that it sold the information that the ADL gathered on Desmond Tutu to the apartheid government in South Africa. And we also know that it was funneling information about the activities of Arab student groups in the United States to the Israeli government. And you even have an FBI internal memo in 1969, 1 year after it had began officially working with the ADL, in which the FBI said it's very possible that the ADL is in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and it would be viewed incredible to assume that the information that the ADL is gathering is not being furnished to an official of the Israeli government. That's the FBI in 1969. So what do we have today? We have the ADL today being the largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the United States. Every single FBI agent is trained by the ADL at one point. And moreover, the ADL has recently employed the former chief of domestic terrorism operations for the FBI, a gentleman by the name of Gregory Ehery, as the ADL vice president of law enforcement and analysis. You have the ADL and the FBI sharing an office together, even in one location, at least in the United States. So in a situation where we have seen recently, particularly, that Elon Musk took, frankly, quite a courageous step in cutting off the Starlink from the Ukrainian military at a time where they wanted to strike the Russian Navy, because he said he didn't want to be party to war crimes, because he viewed it as a mini Pearl Harbor. It is not beyond the realms of possibility that the FBI is acting through the ADL to try and push Elon Musk out of ownership of Twitter. You have to remember that before Elon Musk owned Twitter, the top shareholders in it were BlackRock and Vanguard, who are the top shareholders in Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, the largest arms companies in the world. You know, Elon Musk and SpaceX have relied massively on US intelligence agencies and military companies like Lockheed Martin throughout history. And, you know, it's a big club, and he's certainly in it. But is he just slightly off script? Is that the reason for a lot of the opposition that we see him facing? But I guess the other question here, which I would like to communicate to our viewers, is that while Elon Musk is off script in some interesting ways, when it comes to the question of Israel, do not be fooled by the fact that a proxy of Israel like the ADL is gunning so heavily for him. Musk is someone that has quite a close and concerning relationship with Israel. So, for example, in order to obtain Twitter, Musk borrowed $1 billion off of a gentleman by the name of Larry Ellison. Well, Larry Ellison is the 7th richest man in the world, tech billionaire, whose company Oracle was set up to service the CIA. Interestingly, Oracle today has the contracts to handle the cloud data of the Ministry of Defense, of the Home Office, of the Foreign Office, and of the NHS. And Oracle itself is so close to Israel that Larry Ellison offered Benjamin Netanyahu the directorship of the company. But can you quite imagine that a company that close to Israel, that could actually have Benjamin Netanyahu as its director, has even one tiny bit of the data from the Home Office and the Ministry of Defense? This is an issue of national security, clearly. But so Musk is very close to Larry Ellison and relied on him to get Twitter. We also know that Musk has signed this deal to collaborate with Autotix, an Israeli intelligence firm, which will handle users' data for verification of identity on Twitter going forward. And that will entail people giving photocopies of their passports, taking selfies and sending them in. But the important thing to remember is that this company that Musk is partnering with was founded by former members of Israel's internal intelligence agency, the Shin Bet. More interestingly, we know that Musk and his Starlink satellites, which we've just heard about in Ukraine, have been used in the regime change operation against Iran. So at a time when Antony Blinken was pontificating online about the importance of the US government, assisting the flow of communication in Iran. Elon Musk responded to him by tweeting that he was activating Starlink now. And in fact, it has been found that there are hundreds of Starlinks over Iran that are easing communication of those who wish to overthrow the government. And Musk has proudly boasted of that role. Another far less known aspect of Musk's involvement in Israel's war against the region has been the assistance of Musk to Israel in the bombing of Syria. His company SpaceX launched satellites for the Israeli spy firm ImageSat International. Now, those satellites were launched over Syria. Because it's not easy for Israeli jets to enter Syrian airspace without some form of resistance, they use the satellites above Syria to target specific sites across the country. Now, just so we're clear about this issue of ImageSat International not just being some private company, literally, its CEO is a current reserve in the Israeli Air Force. It has a head of marketing who is actually an active duty member of the Israeli Air Force. And it's a company which has been absolutely essential to the 1,000 Israeli airstrikes on Syria in the last 6 years alone. And so Musk has now launched satellites for this company. And it was such a welcomed decision that the Israeli embassy in the US and ImageSat International both publicly thanked Elon Musk on Twitter for taking that action. So there's a lot happening, and there are very interesting contradictions and cracks in the monolith emerging. And I guess it is our job, through the work that we all are attempting to do, to really crank up those cracks, to continue to throw sugar in the petrol tank, and to disrupt really the movement of this machine. But thank you very much, John, and thank you, Roberto, for joining us today. And thank you to our crew in the studio today. Please join us next time on the Watchdog here on Mid Press.